One of the most secret locations in the entire Soviet Union was right here. Inside a small, cramped room on the 7th floor of the United States Embassy. This was the CIA station. Central Moscow, 21 Novinsky Boulevard. About a 20-minute walk from the Kremlin. The 7th of December, 1982. 2 men and 2 women get into a car in the parking lot of the U.S. Embassy. A Soviet police officer standing guard at the entrance watches them and immediately reports the movement to the KGB. Soviet intelligence routinely monitored embassy staff phone calls made through the city telephone network. Because of this, the KGB already knew the diplomats were supposedly heading to a planned birthday celebration for one of their colleagues. What Soviet intelligence did not know was that the 2 men getting into the car were not diplomats at all. They were CIA officers. The planned party was nothing more than a cover story. The large birthday cake carried by one of the women was actually a classified device. And all of this was the beginning of a complex operation codenamed Jack in the Box. Magicians and spies have a lot in common. The primary objective of both is to divert the observer's attention. In the case of American intelligence officers, their audience was the Soviet security services, a very demanding crowd. KGB surveillance teams were almost always tailing vehicles belonging to U.S. diplomats. During surveillance, KGB cars followed at a short distance behind the target vehicle. That meant that when turning onto a side street, there was a brief moment when the American car disappeared from the KGB's line of sight. Those seconds were when the magic had to happen. A car carrying American diplomats drives through the streets of Moscow. Under the outer layer of American clothing, the agent sitting in the front passenger seat is wearing the outfit of a typical Soviet pensioner. On the knees of the woman sitting behind him is a cake. In reality, it is a complex mechanism resembling a children's toy known as a jack-in-the-box, a clown on a spring. At around 7 p.m., the American car turns onto the correct street. The driver slows down slightly, the door opens, and the agent jumps out of the front passenger seat, now fully resembling a Soviet retiree. At that exact moment, the woman in the back places the cake where the agent had just been sitting. She pulls a lever, and a dummy appears from the box, resembling the silhouette of the missing colleague. Everything happens within just a few seconds. The disguised CIA agent manages to take only a few steps along the sidewalk when a KGB vehicle appears from around the corner. They see that there are still 4 people inside the American car, and that it continues along its planned route. The illusion worked, but this is not the end of the operation. The CIA agent will further alter his appearance, ride several trams, and walk through multiple streets on foot to make absolutely sure he is not being followed. Because the person the American is about to meet is the most valuable intelligence asset the United States has inside the Soviet Union, a billion-dollar spy. Spies are almost mythical creatures. Most ordinary people have only seen them in movies, and if it weren't for the occasional news stories about arrests, exchanges, and expulsions, they could easily be placed on the same list as elves and unicorns. That is why the story I am about to tell today feels almost like a doorway into a spy version of Narnia. It has all the familiar elements of a classic espionage film: dead drops, hidden cameras, lethal poison capsules inside ballpoint pens, secret signals, surveillance and counter-surveillance, disguises, and encrypted messages. But what matters most is that this story is entirely real. Every person involved has a date of birth, a date of death, and a unique biography in between. The main character is one of the most successful American intelligence assets ever recruited inside the USSR. For many years, he supplied the CIA with classified information whose value exceeded $1 billion. And all of it happened in the very center of Moscow, right under the nose of the KGB. The Central Intelligence Agency was born out of catastrophe. In 1941, Pearl Harbor happened. The surprise Japanese attack led to the deaths of several thousand American servicemen. Dozens of ships were damaged or destroyed. According to government investigations, one of the main reasons the tragedy was even possible was the poor coordination between different intelligence services. To ensure that something like this would never happen again, the CIA was created in 1947, the first centralized intelligence service in the history of the United States. In the years following its founding, the organization significantly expanded its mission. Espionage and covert operations became core responsibilities. The CIA took the front line in the Cold War. The primary adversary was the Soviet Union. The agency actively collected intelligence outside the USSR, from refugees, immigrants, Soviet military personnel, and employees of diplomatic missions around the world. At the same time, the Americans clearly understood that the most valuable sources of information were located inside the country itself. And that was the main problem. The Soviet state tightly controlled the lives of its citizens. From the perspective of civil rights and freedoms, not great. From the perspective of counterintelligence, absolutely phenomenal. One CIA officer admitted in the early 1950s that recruiting an agent with access to important information inside the Soviet Union was about as difficult as landing spies on Mars. As a result, American intelligence on Soviet military plans was extremely limited. A dangerous situation during a Cold War that could easily turn hot. In this area, the CIA had only a handful of truly major successes. For several decades after World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union competed across many fields. But if there is one area where Americans arguably had no equal, it was business. 1953, Vienna. An unknown man hands an envelope to an American diplomat. The letter is written in Russian. Its author is Major Pyotr Popov of the main intelligence directorate, who was serving in Vienna at the time. He offers cooperation to the Americans. Over the following years, Popov became the CIA's most valuable Soviet agent. He passed a large volume of classified materials to the Americans, including information about Soviet plans for the use of nuclear weapons in the event of war. In 1958, Popov was urgently recalled to Moscow due to growing suspicions. He was interrogated, and his betrayal was exposed. At first, the KGB used him as a double agent to feed disinformation to the Americans. During this period, Popov managed to transmit a short message to the CIA stating that he had been compromised. A Soviet court sentenced the spy to the highest punishment. He was executed. 1961, Moscow. Oleg Penkovsky is one of the senior officials of the State Committee for the Coordination of Scientific Research, a complex-sounding position that, in reality, serves only as a cover. Penkovsky is a colonel of the GRU, Soviet military intelligence. During numerous foreign business trips, he conducted covert operations aimed at stealing Western technologies. At one of the official receptions for foreign businessmen in Moscow, he handed a letter to a British citizen. In this letter, Penkovsky addressed the American and British authorities. Over the next several years, the newly recruited agent passed thousands of photographs of classified documents to officers of the CIA and MI6. These documents related to the Soviet armed forces and played a crucial role during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Thanks to Penkovsky, the West possessed extensive information about the latest developments and the locations of Soviet missiles. At the end of 1962, the agent suddenly disappeared. Shortly afterward, it became clear that Penkovsky had come under suspicion. By the KGB, a hidden camera was installed in his apartment. Later, during a search, Western espionage equipment and other evidence of cooperation with foreign intelligence services were discovered. The trial of Penkovsky in 1963 was conducted publicly. The details were widely covered by Soviet media. That same year, the spy was sentenced to death and executed. After this, the activity of the Moscow CIA station virtually froze for many years. The total number of CIA agents working under diplomatic cover did not exceed just a few people. CIA leadership feared that even if they managed to recruit valuable assets inside the Soviet Union, there was a high probability they would turn out to be KGB-controlled double agents, feeding false information to the Americans. This concern was reinforced by the story of Pyotr Popov. Such a cautious approach persisted until the mid-1970s. Within the CIA, a generational shift was taking place at multiple levels. Younger, bolder officers were arriving, people who wanted to act. January 1977, the head of the CIA's Moscow station, Robert Fulton, is refueling his car. This gas station in central Moscow was primarily used by diplomats from various countries. At the moment Fulton gets into his vehicle, an unfamiliar man approaches him. A stocky man of average height, appearing to be around 50 years old, wearing a coat and a fur hat, just like millions of Soviet men. The stranger asks in English, "Are you an American? I need to speak with you." Fulton asks what he wants. The man suddenly switches to Russian, says, "I'm sorry," hands Fulton a note, and quickly walks away. The entire scene lasts no more than 15 seconds. The note contains several sentences in Russian. The author says he wants to confidentially meet with a representative of the American embassy to discuss important matters. The message also includes a detailed drawing of a proposed meeting plan. Fulton reads the note. In the very room on the 7th floor of the embassy, only here can American intelligence officers feel relatively safe and be themselves. Outside the station, even inside the embassy building, they must act cautiously and strictly within their cover identities. All CIA representatives assigned to the USSR worked under diplomatic cover. On paper, they were employees of the U.S. Embassy. As a result, most of their time was spent on routine bureaucratic work. They knew perfectly well that they were under surveillance, not only outside the diplomatic compound, but inside it as well. The embassy's service staff consisted mostly of Soviet citizens, some of whom provided information to the KGB. Fulton sends information about the note and the encounter at the gas station to CIA headquarters in Langley. The response is clear: do not make contact. It could be a trap. Several weeks later, the same stranger again approaches Fulton's car, this time not far from the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. He hands over another note. Once again, it contains a proposal to meet and coordinates, but no additional information. The CIA again decides not to initiate contact. A few more weeks pass, and the same man delivers another letter to the station chief. This time, it contains more information. The stranger writes that he understands American concerns and introduces himself as an engineer working at a classified defense-related enterprise Once again, he proposes a new date and meeting location. Fulton believes that the contact is not working for the KGB. Otherwise, he would not be making so many attempts to deliver a message. However, CIA headquarters remain skeptical. What are the odds that a stranger would approach a random car in a diplomat's parking area and accidentally reach the head of the Moscow station? Fulton, however, believes it truly was a coincidence. The man simply chose the first car he saw, with American license plates. Regardless, headquarters once again decides not to make contact. Several months later, Fulton ignores yet another attempt by the man to hand him a package. This level of caution was driven by another factor as well. Over the previous year, the CIA had lost several valuable Soviet agents, including ones operating inside the USSR. The most well-known of them was Alexander Ogorodnik, a Soviet diplomat recruited. While working in Colombia, Ogorodnik enjoyed a luxurious lifestyle and agreed to cooperate with the Americans in exchange for generous compensation. Soon after the first contacts in Colombia, Ogorodnik was transferred to a higher position in Moscow. There, he continued working with the CIA. Information exchanges often took place through so-called dead drops. These were special locations where a recruited agent left classified documents, photographs, or other important materials. A CIA officer would later retrieve the package. The system worked both ways. When the Americans needed to pass something to the agent, this was a rather old-school espionage method, even for that time, but relatively safe. In this setup, the CIA officer did not meet the contact in person. Nevertheless, in 1977, the KGB arrested a female employee of the U.S. Embassy while she was attempting to retrieve a package from Alexander Ogorodnik. The woman was, in fact, a CIA officer. It later emerged that Ogorodnik had been arrested earlier and during interrogation managed to swallow a suicide capsule hidden inside an ink pen provided by the Americans. The embassy employee was declared persona non grata on the day of her arrest and immediately expelled from the country. This was standard practice for nearly all individuals caught spying. In other words, when an operation failed, the CIA lost twice. They lost not only the recruited agent, but also their undercover officer. That is precisely why CIA headquarters reacted so cautiously to the stranger's repeated attempts to pass a message to an embassy employee. If a face-to-face meeting turned out to be a KGB trap, the CIA would lose yet another agent in Moscow without receiving any valuable intelligence in return. Almost a year passes after the first encounter with the stranger at the gas station. The man makes two new attempts to pass messages to the driver of a car with American license plates. At the same gas station, this time, he approaches ordinary embassy employees who forward the letters to CIA officers. The stranger acts boldly and fully reveals his identity in the messages. My name is Adolf Georgievich Tolkachev. Since 1954, I have been working at the Scientific Research Institute of Radio Engineering. I currently hold the position of chief designer. Both letters are quite lengthy. In them, Tolkachev provides his biography, the full names of his wife and his 12-year-old son, his home and work phone numbers, as well as his home address. Tolkachev also states his readiness to provide details of a highly classified radar system on which he is working. At the Design Bureau, after verification, CIA headquarters decides that the contact is credible. He potentially possesses extremely valuable information, and agents must meet with him. The new contact is assigned the codename Sphere. In 1976, Soviet pilot Viktor Belenko defected. He flew his MiG-25 interceptor from an airbase in the Far East to Japan and surrendered. Belenko was granted political asylum in the United States. In exchange, he provided the Americans with classified information about the latest developments in military aircraft and radar systems. Adolf Tolkachev regularly listened to Radio Liberty and Voice of America, one of the few ways for Soviet citizens to learn news. Bypassing Soviet censorship, it was there that Tolkachev heard the story of the defector pilot. In one of his letters to the CIA, he explicitly wrote that he wanted to do what Belenko had done. Tolkachev also explained how MiG-25 designs were modified after the pilot's defection and expressed readiness to provide information on the latest development in this field. The subject was a classified radar system for fighter aircraft. For a long time, the Soviet armed forces had a significant weakness in radar technology. Existing designs were extremely poor at detecting low-flying targets, whether aircraft or missiles. This potentially gave the Americans a serious advantage. Information about such developments had a major influence on the CIA's decision to meet with Tolkachev. The intelligence was critically important. Moreover, the KGB was unlikely to expose such sensitive details in written correspondence merely to entrap and expel another CIA officer. Within the Moscow station, a handler is assigned to Tolkachev. A handler is the CIA officer who works most closely with an agent, including phone contact and personal meetings. John Gilsher was born and raised in the United States. His parents emigrated from Russia after the revolution. As a result, Gilsher spoke Russian almost flawlessly. His slight accent suggested someone from Latvia or Estonia rather than an American. After serving in the military, John accepted an offer to work for the CIA and ultimately ended up in the Moscow station. Gilsher becomes the handler of Adolf Tolkachev. Task number 1: establish contact with the new agent. The CIA has Tolkachev's home phone number. However, simply calling him from the embassy is impossible. The KGB closely monitors American diplomats, apartment searches, phone tapping at the embassy, planting listening devices in clothing or typewriters, and, of course, constant surveillance. To communicate with agents by phone, CIA officers in Moscow used public payphones. Gilsher and his wife develop an entire operation. The couple plans a visit to the Bolshoi Theater in advance. During one of the intermissions, Gilsher leaves to make first contact with Tolkachev. At that moment, his wife distracts their Soviet colleague from the embassy, a woman who works for the KGB. During the short phone call, the CIA officer greets Tolkachev. He says that headquarters has received his letters and that they will contact him in more detail soon. After that, Gilsher returns to the auditorium. Their colleague, who was working for the KGB, notices nothing. During the next call, the CIA provides Tolkachev with coordinates where he can retrieve a package containing detailed instructions. It will be waiting for Agent Sphere near a phone booth on one of the city streets. The drop will be hidden inside a work glove. Tolkachev successfully retrieves the package. Inside, he finds a detailed guide on how to pass classified information to the CIA. In this case, it is a so-called secret letter. The Americans prepared a fake letter, allegedly sent by an American tourist from Moscow to her grandfather in the United States. According to the plan, Agent Sphere must write the classified information he knows on the reverse side of the letter's pages. This must be done using specially provided carbon paper and encoded into a cipher. After that, the agent must mail the letter to a dummy American address. That actually leads to the CIA. The agency knows that the KGB will almost certainly open the envelope for inspection. This was common practice for foreign correspondence. However, Soviet intelligence should not notice the encoded text because it would be invisible, and even if they did detect it, they would be unable to decipher it. Tolkachev was provided with a special code table. An identical table was held only by the CIA, meaning only they could break the code. As a result, a few weeks later, the Moscow station receives Tolkachev's letter. It shows clear signs of having been opened. However, the secret code remains intact. Using it, Agent Sphere reveals data about the latest Soviet developments in radar systems, targeting systems, and test results. The information is of great value to the Americans. Moreover, Tolkachev followed all instructions in preparing the message flawlessly. The time has come to meet him in person. It is necessary to establish closer contact and discuss the terms of cooperation. A personal meeting with an informant inside the Soviet Union is a major risk. If the operation fails, it would trigger a serious diplomatic scandal. However, the CIA is confident that such a meeting is necessary. A Soviet agent inside the country with access to classified developments had long been a goal of the CIA. Tolkachev could become that very source. By the late 1970s, Adolf Tolkachev turned 50. Within the Soviet system of values, he could be considered a successful man. A high-ranking position as chief designer at the Fazatron Design Bureau, part of a research institute, working for the military-industrial complex. This photograph vividly reflects the social status of the newly recruited CIA agent. In the foreground, the U.S. Embassy in central Moscow, and Tolkachev's apartment was located in the nearby high-rise building. Such housing was available only to individuals holding important positions. One of the first questions John Gilsher asks during their personal meeting is about Tolkachev's motivation. What pushed him to take such a risk? At first, Tolkachev tries to avoid answering, saying it is a complicated question that would require a lot of time. Eventually, he simply says that he is a dissident by nature. They then move on to discuss financial compensation. Tolkachev again refers to the case of pilot Belenko and says he would like to receive the same amount from the United States. Gilsher replies that he is unaware of Belenko's compensation and hands over 1,000 rubles. He says that the CIA is ready to pay that amount every month. Tolkachev asks for 10,000. However, both sums are rather insignificant, given the potential risks. In his position, the chief designer of a classified enterprise earned more than 300 rubles per month. That was several times higher than the salary of an average Soviet engineer. Later, Tolkachev would admit that he needed the money more as a symbol of recognition, because under conditions of constant shortages, even in the capital, many goods were impossible to buy. The agent hands Gilsher a notebook containing a new batch of classified information. He immediately mentions that if the CIA provided him with a camera, he could photograph documents. For example, at the end of the workday, when colleagues left the office, because rewriting and redrawing detailed schematics was difficult and extremely time-consuming. Tolkachev and Gilsher spend about 40 minutes together walking through the empty, dark streets of January Moscow. Following the meeting, the CIA officer reports to headquarters that the new agent demonstrated a responsible attitude and expressed readiness to continue cooperation. For future meetings, the CIA develops a special plan. They select several locations not far from Tolkachev's home so he can leave under the pretext of a walk. Each location is given a simple Russian first name. For example, Valera or Nina. First, a CIA officer calls Tolkachev's home and asks for Valera. Tolkachev must reply that the caller has the wrong number and hang up. He then leaves his apartment to meet his handler at the location codenamed Valera. Over the course of several subsequent meetings, Agent Sphere continues to provide the CIA with valuable intelligence. For example, key design details and system specifications of the newest Soviet fighter jet, the Su-27. The CIA agrees to provide Tolkachev with a miniature camera and half of the amount he originally demanded, 5,000 rubles. However, Agent Sphere's demands grow rapidly. At the next meeting, he asks the CIA to provide him with a poison capsule to be used in case of capture, while also significantly increasing his price. Now he demands a 6-figure sum in US dollars. He claims that this is the amount that Voice of America allegedly reported as the reward paid to pilot Belenko. For the CIA, this new demand is, of course, a problem. A poison capsule for a relatively new agent is a serious risk. What if he panics and uses it in a situation that poses no real danger? In addition, if the authorities were somehow to discover the capsule on Tolkachev, it would immediately raise unmistakable suspicion toward him. The hundreds of thousands of dollars Tolkachev requested were also a substantial sum. The value of $1 US in the USSR at the time was estimated at several rubles. This refers, of course, to the black market. There was no legal free purchase or sale of foreign currency. First, the Moscow station needed to convince headquarters in Langley that the new agent was worth such money. Second, a logistical issue arose. Where would Tolkachev store the cash? And would he be able to spend it responsibly without attracting suspicion? In the end, the CIA decides not to provide Agent Sphere with a poison capsule for now, but agrees to his financial terms. After analyzing the data provided by Tolkachev, the Americans realize that they will be able to save tens of millions of dollars for their military-industrial complex. With access to information about Soviet developments, the United States can allocate its defense resources more efficiently. In addition, the new agent impresses them with his disciplined and strategic approach. In one of his letters to his handler, He provides a detailed plan, covering the next 12 years. The plan outlines what information Tolkachev can potentially deliver to the Americans, as well as the resources and time required to obtain it. Agent Sphere's goal, in his own words, is to inflict maximum damage on the Soviet Union. Why? Tolkachev does not explain. Spy gadgets from James Bond movies look almost fantastical, but only until you begin to study real intelligence history. In 1979, the CIA provides Adolf Tolkachev with the Mali camera. It was smaller than a matchbox. This was supposed to significantly assist Agent Sphere in his espionage work. Until then, he had been forced to rewrite everything by hand. He could not use photocopying machines at the Institute. Management feared potential espionage using these devices. The copy room was always staffed by special personnel, and no one else was allowed inside. In addition, there was a strict procedure for using the machines. Which documents were copied, for whom, when, all details were carefully recorded. As a result, the camera became the logical solution. Removing documents from the Institute building was strictly forbidden. However, Tolkachev learned how to bypass the system. He would take documents from the archive, hide them under his coat, and leave the building during his lunch break. He would then go home, calmly rewrite or photograph the materials, return to the Institute after lunch, and place the documents back into storage. The first attempt at using the secret Mali camera turns out to be unsuccessful. After developing the film, the CIA realizes that Tolkachev took the photos in insufficient lighting. As a result, nothing is visible in the images. After that, Tolkachev is given one of the CIA's latest developments, the Tropel camera, about the size of a AA battery, as well as a standard Pentax camera as a backup option. Throughout 1979, Gilsher meets with Tolkachev 5 times. For Gilsher, each meeting represents a carefully planned operation. The KGB was well aware that some embassy employees worked for the CIA. Moreover, they often knew exactly who those people were. As a result, surveillance was an inseparable part of life for members of the Moscow station. Before every meeting with Tolkachev, Gilsher had to make sure he had successfully shaken off surveillance. To do this, a CIA officer might, for example, leave the Soviet Union on what appeared to be an overseas assignment, only to return to Moscow unexpectedly earlier than planned. While information from border control was still making its way to the KGB, Gilsher had literally only a few hours to meet with the agent without being followed. Disguises and other methods were also frequently used. Every CIA officer underwent special training in these techniques. These precautions allowed the CIA to meet safely with Agent Sphere. In general, the Americans tried to use face-to-face meetings for information transfer as rarely as possible. However, in this case, the initiative came from Tolkachev himself. Personal contact was important to him, and the CIA was increasingly willing to accommodate this, given the growing value of the agent. With the use of cameras, Tolkachev's productivity increases dramatically. He brings to meetings hundreds of pages of secret notes and hundreds of rolls of film, containing photographs of documents and technical diagrams. These include top-secret radar developments for the MiG-25 aircraft, the state of Soviet missile defense systems, and strategic documentation on the development of specific systems for military aircraft. All the way through 1990, Tolkachev becomes fully aware of his own value to the CIA. Gilsher now brings him to meetings, large bundles of cash, containing more than 100,000 rubles. But Agent Sphere raises the price once again. He says that last time he made a mistake, and that he does not need a six-figure sum, but a number with 6 zeros. This now means millions of dollars. This fact, without exaggeration, causes panic at CIA headquarters in Langley. No agent in the history of the service has ever received such compensation. It is an insane amount of money. After long deliberations, the CIA agrees. They are prepared to pay $200,000 upfront, and then $300,000 per year. The reason for this decision is simple. They understand that Adolf Tolkachev is worth the money. The data he has already provided will remain relevant for the next 8 to 10 years. At the beginning of 1980, experts from the U.S. Air Force estimate that the intelligence supplied by Agent Sphere is worth approximately $2 billion. Adolf Tolkachev officially becomes a billion-dollar spy. Forbes magazine was not published in the USSR. Forbes did not print lists of the highest-paid spies. Forbes could not write that a chief designer, even of a prominent but still only one Soviet bureau, had an income higher than that of the President of the United States. The 1970s and early 1980s in the USSR are commonly referred to as the era of stagnation. One of the main questions was not how to earn money, but where to obtain goods. Under conditions of constant shortages, Tolkachev could hardly physically spend the entire amount paid to him by the CIA. He simply stockpiled most of the rubles, along with espionage equipment, in a storage space in his apartment, where his wife and son never went. Tolkachev also received from the Americans goods that were difficult or impossible to obtain in the Soviet Union, books by dissidents that were not published domestically, high-quality razor blades, French medications, Czech stationery, records by Western rock bands for his son, and other items. Part of Tolkachev's payments was deposited into a special overseas bank account. The CIA suggested that Agent Sphere consider the possibility of exfiltration. This was the name given to a covert operation to remove a spy from the country. At first, Tolkachev did not seriously consider this option, but gradually, he began to think about it. It is important to note, however, that this was not about immediate extraction. First, the Americans were interested in keeping the valuable agent active for as long as possible. Second, exfiltration was a complex procedure that required more than a year of preparation, and the Moscow station had only one such experience. In 1980, KGB Major Viktor Shemov, along with his wife and daughter, secretly crossed the border between the USSR and Finland. They were hidden inside a car by CIA officers. The family was then transported to the United States. A year earlier, the young officer Shemov, disillusioned with the Soviet system, had made contact with the CIA in Moscow. His initial condition for cooperation was escape to the United States. After the successful exfiltration of Shemov, the KGB believed for several months that their officer and his family had fallen victim to ordinary crime and had therefore disappeared. This exfiltration became the first assignment for a newly arrived CIA officer at the Moscow station, David Rolfe. He was just over 30 years old. It is Rolfe who becomes the new handler of Adolf Tolkachev. One evening, in October 1980, David Rolfe and his wife enter the building of the American Embassy in Moscow. The police officer at the entrance records their arrival Rolf immediately heads to a room used by technical staff. There, he changes clothes, applies makeup, and transforms himself to resemble one of the embassy technicians. The KGB paid far less attention to such ordinary personnel than to potential CIA officers. In this new appearance, David Rolf leaves the building. From that point on, he acts strictly according to the techniques and rules he learned during CIA training. He rides a tram, enters a flower shop, boards a bus, and walks along the street. Throughout this process, Rolf carefully scans nearby vehicles, other passengers, and pedestrians. At the very end, Rolf darts into one of the apartment entrances and quickly runs up the stairwell. This maneuver is meant to provoke any potential security officers into chasing him. He waits on the staircase for a while. Nothing happens. The entire surveillance detection operation lasts approximately an hour and a half. Finally, at 9 p.m., Rolf arrives at the designated location. This is his first meeting with Agent Sphere. After introductions, they move on to discuss current matters. Rolf informs Tolkachev that his request for a poison capsule has finally been approved and that he will receive it. At one of the next meetings, previously, the spy had persistently requested this from the CIA, but headquarters had repeatedly refused. One of the reasons for the change in position was the increased operational risk associated with Agent Sphere's activities. The issue was this: when secret documents were retrieved from the Research Institute's archive, the employee had to sign a log. The problem was that on his own initiative and at the CIA's request, Tolkachev had already taken out many documents that had nothing to do with his direct responsibilities at the Bureau. If the KGB decided to audit the logs, everything would become obvious. Tolkachev would be arrested immediately. In addition, security rules at the Research Institute had changed. Now, when retrieving documents from storage, an employee had to leave their pass there. At the same time, the pass was required to enter the building itself. This meant that the method of taking documents from storage, hiding them under a coat, going home during lunch, photographing them, and then returning to the Institute was no longer possible for Agent Sphere. At the meeting, Tolkachev tells his handler that he has found a workaround. He has an acquaintance in the archive who agrees to provide documents without requiring a pass. When the CIA officer asks whether this is dangerous, Tolkachev responds philosophically, "Everything is dangerous." At the Moscow station, a decision is made to prepare a duplicate pass for the agent. However, this will take a significant amount of time. In the meantime, Tolkachev will continue to take risks. In 1981, Agent Sphere is exposed. However, this is not done by the KGB or the Institute's leadership, but by his own wife. Tolkachev's wife, Natalia, finds a camera and several other CIA devices. At home, Tolkachev forgot to hide the evidence. After another lunchtime photo session, his wife immediately realizes that her husband is engaged in espionage. Tolkachev does not deny it and admits to working for the KGB. Natalia points out that by doing this, Adolf is putting both her and their son at risk and asks him to stop spying. Tolkachev decides to lie and promises that he will quit. At the moment, when Natalia discovered the espionage equipment on her husband's desk, she could hardly have suspected that Agent Sphere, in many ways, came into existence because of her. Natalia's maiden name was Kuzmina. Her father, Ivan Kuzmin, was an editor at the industrial newspaper, Light Industry. His wife, Sofia, was born into a family of Ukrainian Jews. Sofia's father later moved to Denmark, where he ran a business quite successfully. From time to time, his daughter visited him in Europe. Soon after one such trip, in 1937, she was arrested by Soviet security services. At the height of Stalin's purges, having a close relative abroad in a capitalist country was more than enough to fall under suspicion. As a formal charge, Sofia was accused of participation in a Trotskyist organization. A week later, her husband Ivan was arrested. Sofia was executed. Just a few months later, Ivan was sent to labor camps. For 10 years, their 2-year-old daughter, Natalia, was placed in an orphanage. Ivan Kuzmin was released in 1947. He died in the mid-1950s, a year after his rehabilitation. Shortly before his death, Ivan told his daughter what had actually happened to him and his wife. Tolkachev knew that his wife read samizdat, that she had refused at work to sign a letter supporting the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, and that she generally felt no warmth toward the Soviet system. He also knew the history of her family, and this became one of the main motivations for Tolkachev's cooperation with the CIA. The future spy himself was born in the late 1920s in Kazakhstan. In early childhood, his family moved to Moscow. After graduating from a polytechnic institute, Tolkachev was assigned to the Research Institute of Radio Engineering, also known as Fazotron. This would become the only place he ever worked. He did not engage in active political activity. Nevertheless, he read banned literature, followed famous dissidents such as Andrei Sakharov and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and listened regularly to Radio Free America. His desire to damage the Soviet system grew gradually. After the famous incident with pilot Viktor Belenko, Tolkachev realized that his main weapon against the USSR was secret documents, technical diagrams, reports, and other critical information about the military-industrial sector. In one of his letters to the CIA, he admitted that he had never been to the United States and was, in general, far from idealizing the country. However, he had the impression that he could live there. That is why Tolkachev decided to supply secret data specifically to the Americans. In 1982, leadership at the CIA's Moscow station changed. The new management placed its bet on so-called deep cover agents. As a rule, CIA officers operated undercover as genuine diplomatic staff, performing routine embassy duties. Deep cover agents, however, arrived as maintenance workers or service personnel. The KGB initially paid far less attention to such individuals. In addition, for some time after arriving in Moscow, these agents lived a monotonous routine. Work, store, home, work, store, home. Once a week, the skating rink on Sunday. As a result, Soviet security services lost interest in them altogether. Moreover, deep cover agents were always newcomers. They had not served in residencies elsewhere in the world, which meant the KGB had no background information on them. It was with officers like these that Tolkachev now met. Despite being provided with a special radio transmitter that could be used to communicate with the Americans remotely, he continued to insist on personal contact. As a result, CIA agents met Agent Sphere, either on the street or inside his Zhiguli, which Tolkachev had purchased recently. Despite tightened security measures, at the Institute, at almost every meeting, he still managed to supply the CIA with hundreds of valuable photographs, documents, and technical diagrams. However, in mid-1982, something strange happens. Tolkachev misses several meetings. Several more meetings are cancelled due to suspicions of KGB surveillance. Finally, CIA officers call Tolkachev at home. No one answers. Tension grows at the Moscow station. There has been no word from the CIA's most valuable spy for several months. In early December, another meeting with Tolkachev is scheduled. This time, to ensure avoidance of KGB surveillance, the Moscow station prepares a complex operation codenamed Jack in the Box. A CIA officer manages to evade surveillance and finally meet with Tolkachev. He apologizes and says that he has been feeling unwell lately due to high blood pressure and has therefore fallen out of schedule. Nevertheless, Tolkachev still brings with him numerous notes and rolls of film containing photographs of secret documents. By early 1983, the CIA has an exfiltration plan ready. For Agent Sphere, the Americans are prepared to extract Tolkachev and his family to the United States. However, Tolkachev ultimately refuses this plan. He speaks about acquaintances who emigrated to Israel and later wrote about their homesickness. Tolkachev says he has realized that he cannot live in another country or even in another city. As a result, the escape plan is no longer considered. For the Americans, this is, in a way, positive news. Their valuable agent continues his work. In April 1983, Tolkachev is summoned by management to discuss a routine matter. At that moment, a phone rings in the boss's office. From the conversation, Tolkachev understands that the caller is the head of the Institute's security service who reports directly to the KGB. He asks for a list of people who worked on a specific type of radar. Information about that very radar had been passed to the CIA just a month earlier. In terror, Tolkachev returns to his office. He begins to think about how the KGB found out. Perhaps there is a mole inside the CIA. Perhaps someone among his colleagues has grown suspicious. Either way, the next day, Tolkachev takes sick leave. In haste, he gathers stacks of cash, cameras, the CIA radio transmitter, dissident books, and foreign goods. He throws everything into his Zhiguli and drives out of the city. There, Tolkachev burns the evidence. Metal components are thrown out of the car window along the road back to Moscow. The next day, before going to his boss's office, Adolf Tolkachev removes the poison capsule from his pen and places it under his tongue. He is certain that KGB officers will be waiting for him. However, it turns out to be yet another routine matter. Over the following weeks, Tolkachev places the capsule under his tongue every time he goes to see management. He also takes the poison to every CIA meeting, and every time he removes documents from the Institute. Weeks and months pass. There is no news inside the Institute about the outcome of the KGB investigation. It is also unclear what the investigation was actually about. One thing is absolutely clear. No matter what happens, Adolf Tolkachev does not intend to be taken alive. Music. In the late 1970s, Edward Lee Howard worked at a consulting firm in Chicago. He was 28 years old and wanted to change his life and see the world. That is why he decided to apply to the CIA. Howard completed training, passed all required tests, and was accepted. In 1982, he received an offer to work at the CIA's Moscow station. Before deployment, Howard underwent training that included access to certain documents of the Moscow station. That means he almost certainly encountered the codename Agent Sphere. Did he know Tolkachev's real name? That remains unknown. Shortly before his departure to Moscow, Howard failed a polygraph test. The same happened. During several follow-up tests, they revealed that Howard had concealed information about minor legal violations in his past. This was compounded by already known issues with alcohol. As a result, Edward Lee Howard was not only removed from the Moscow assignment, but dismissed from the CIA entirely. Before his dismissal, he signed a document committing to keep secret all information obtained during his service. However, Howard was bitter. During a trip to Europe, he contacted representatives of the Soviet embassy and agreed to provide them with classified information for $60,000. Among this information were details about a valuable CIA agent inside a research institute working for the Soviet military-industrial complex. It was clear that even without knowing the agent's exact name, the KGB would be able to identify the spy. It was only a matter of time. In 1984, despite worsening health problems and the growing fear of an investigation at the Institute, Tolkachev continues to supply the CIA with critically important intelligence. Increasingly, he no longer removes documents from the building. Instead, he photographs them inside the Institute's restrooms. Due to poor lighting, many of the images turn out to be unusable. But one way or another, the information provided by Agent Sphere continues to be of enormous value. At one of the meetings, a CIA officer informs Tolkachev that the balance in his foreign bank account has reached nearly $2 million. In early March 1985, another meeting with a CIA officer is scheduled. However, Tolkachev does not show up. For several months, the Americans leave signals for new meetings. Tolkachev does not appear again. Another meeting, planned for early June, is canceled by the CIA itself due to intensified KGB surveillance. A few days later, over the weekend, Tolkachev and his wife drive out of the city. On their way back, their car is stopped by traffic police. Tolkachev takes his documents and steps out of the vehicle. At the moment he approaches the officer, several men run toward him, seize him, and carry him to a nearby parked service car. None of them are traffic police officers. All of them are KGB operatives. The day before, Soviet security services had conducted a search of Tolkachev's apartment. There they found cameras, a receiver, cash, a poison capsule, notes. In other words, everything that unmistakably pointed to Tolkachev's cooperation with Western intelligence services. A week later, a CIA officer goes to another scheduled meeting with Tolkachev. After confirming that he is not being followed, the officer arrives. At the meeting location, he sees Tolkachev's familiar Zhiguli. As the officer approaches the car, several strong men rush out from an ambush, force him into a vehicle, and take him to interrogation. At Lubyanka, on the CIA officer, they find secret cameras, bundles of cash, and other evidence, showing that he is not a simple diplomat. That same night, he is declared persona non grata and expelled from the country. At the Moscow station, it becomes immediately clear. If the KGB knew the exact time and place of the meeting with Tolkachev, there is only one conclusion. The story of the billion-dollar spy is over. In August 1985, a Soviet KGB officer in Rome defects to the United States. Among other things, he reports about a valuable source within Soviet intelligence known under the code name Robert. This agent was a former CIA employee who had been preparing for assignment to the Moscow station, but failed security tests and was dismissed. For those involved in the Soviet division of the CIA, there is no doubt left that the information about Tolkachev was provided by Edward Lee Howard. The FBI interrogates Howard. He denies everything. He is released, but placed under round-the-clock surveillance. Nevertheless, Howard manages to quietly leave his home, fly out of the country, first reach Europe, and then make his way to the Soviet Union, where he is granted asylum. In the 1990s, he will publish memoirs in which he denies any involvement in Tolkachev's exposure. In the early 2000s, the 50-year-old Howard will die after a fall in his Moscow apartment. In 1986, Adolf Tolkachev is sentenced to the highest measure of punishment. On the eve of the execution, he is allowed to see his son. Tolkachev asks for his forgiveness. His son replies that there is nothing to forgive. In October 1986, the state news agency TASS announces that Adolf Tolkachev has been executed for espionage and treason. Tolkachev's wife, Natalia, is sentenced to 3 years in prison on the grounds that she knew about her husband's activities, but failed to inform the authorities. In 1987, she is released and returns to Moscow. In March 1991, Natalia dies of cancer. In December 1991, the Soviet Union collapses.